Well, good afternoon, and it is a pleasure to be here to be part of this Tolkien 50th anniversary seminar. I'm Dr. Holly Ordway. I'm professor of faith and culture at the Ward and Fire Institute and visiting professor at Houston Christian University. My scholarly work focuses on Tolkien and the Inklings, and I've written 2 books on that subject, Tolkien's Modern Reading, Middle-earth Beyond the Middle Ages, and Tolkien's Faith, a Spiritual Biography. And my talk this afternoon is on the title, Fundamentally Religious and Catholic, Authorial Intent and the Intentional Fallacy. So let me begin with these words from The Hobbit. Good morning, said Bilbo, and he meant it. The sun was shining, and the grass was very green. But Gandalf looked at him from under long, bushy eyebrows that stuck out further than the brim of his shady hat. What do you mean? He said. Do you wish me a good morning? Or mean that it is a good morning whether I want it or not? Or that you feel good this morning? Or that it is a morning to be good on? All of them at once, said Bilbo. What I will explore this afternoon is the question of Tolkien's authorial intent, with particular consideration of the difficult question of the religious element in his writing. And as Tolkien said with regard to the study of fairy stories, this is a rash adventure. There are pitfalls for the unwary and dungeons for the overbold. First, let me set out a brief preliminary framework. The term intentional fallacy was coined in 1946 by W.K. Wimsatt and M.C. Beardsley, who present the fallacy as the view that in order to judge the poet's performance, we must know what he intended. Wimsatt and Beardsley explicitly reference a debate between C.S. Lewis and E.M.W. Tillyard in the early 1930s, published in 1939 as The Personal Heresy. Tillyard argued that part of the value of poetry consists in gaining contact with the normal personality of the poet. Lewis rejected this idea. It is he who calls it a heresy. And just as the personal heresy is a reminder that we mustn't assume that a literary text provides direct, unambiguous access to the personality or the views of the author, so the intentional fallacy is a reminder that even seemingly direct and unambiguous knowledge of the author's stated intentions is not the only thing that matters, nor is it definitive for the interpretation of the text. As Lewis put it, of a book's meaning, its author is not necessarily the best and is never a perfect judge. One of his intentions usually was that it should have a certain meaning. He cannot be sure that it has. He cannot even be sure that the meaning he intended it to have was, in every way, or even at all, better than the meaning which readers find in it. Here, therefore, the critic has great freedom to range without fear of contradiction from the author's superior knowledge. However, used with care, authorial intent does provide a valuable way to gain insight into a text. It's particularly helpful with regard to identifying and counterbalancing any assumptions we might bring to the text, which might otherwise go unnoticed. Even C.S. Lewis held that authorial intention matters at some level. This topic was very probably something that he and Tolkien discussed at some length, since the 2 men planned to write a book together called Language and Human Nature. It was even announced in 1948 as a forthcoming title. No such book was ever written, but a fragment of Lewis's draft survives. In it, Lewis recognized the intention of the author as one of the elements of meaningful language, which he defined as the system of vocal noises meant, psychological sense, to mean, symbolical sense. The question of what a particular author meant by what he had written was often considered by Tolkien in the course of his professional life. In his commentary on Beowulf, Tolkien provides some practical wisdom that will help us to navigate this topic. One, that the meaning of the poet cannot be arrived at by a mere bald literal translation or by warming it up with modern diction without appreciating the idiom. And 2, that we constantly need to know more than we do, tackling Beowulf direct and without any previous knowledge. He's referring to understanding the language Old English, but the principle is broader. What is the idiom, the particular usage of the author? At its most basic level, Authorial intent includes the way in which the author expected his words to be understood by his contemporary audience in the particular context in which they were first communicated. There are many American readers of Tolkien's works and American Tolkien scholars. I'm one of them. But over the years, I've noticed that on the other side of the pond, Americans don't always appreciate Tolkien's idiom. We are indeed two nations separated by a common language. Even in the understanding of plain biographical facts, I've seen many American readers tripped up by words like professor, Don, tutor, college, public school, and so on. Tolkien also reminds us that we need to know more than we do. Context matters not only for his imaginative writings, but also for extra textual material used to discern authorial intent. Michael Drout has pointed out that by assuming the transparency of Tolkien's letters, critics assume, first of all, and most problematically, that the letters do not need to be interpreted, and second, that Tolkien's evaluation of his own work is correct. Now we need to consider Tolkien's self-contradiction, or his apparent self-contradiction, with regard to authorial intent. I want to make a distinction here between two different kinds of contradiction, implicit and explicit. Implicit contradiction has to do with the fact that the legendarium was written as a whole over different times over the course of Tolkien's long life, and certain elements apparently contradict each other. For instance, are the orcs just irreducibly evil, or could they repent? Was Galadriel rebellious, or not really? Did the world of Arda change from flat to round, or was it always round? To various degrees, these are questions that Tolkien had different views on at different times. And I would argue that any attempt to discern a clear, definitive, single authorial intent on these topics is futile. For the works that were published in his lifetime, we have a text that represents his final authorial intention, but even that could change, as for instance in his revision of The Hobbit, to change the story of Bilbo's gaining of the ring from Gollum. I certainly don't think that we can identify authorial intent clearly for the texts that he didn't complete, especially not the ones he was still tinkering with at the time of his death. For one thing, we need to be careful not to conflate Christopher Tolkien's editorial decisions with Tolkien's own authorial decisions, especially in the published Silmarillion, which, unlike the later History of Middle-earth volumes, presents as a coherent, finished text materials that were in fact anything but finished. Even going purely by the date of composition of the drafts doesn't necessarily help, since Tolkien's mode of composition was to think on paper. Just because he wrote it down doesn't mean that he had made a final decision. But the contradictions in the drafts are interesting in other ways. The tension between different versions of an idea shows us something about Tolkien's creative process and what he held to be important. And that's at least as interesting, if not more, than determining a once-and-for-all status for the orcs. Now, the other kind of apparent contradiction has to do with his explicit statements of authorial intent. So let's turn now to considering Tolkien's intentions for his magnum opus, The Lord of the Rings. What does he say is the meaning of his book? He says, "The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. As for any meaning, any inner meaning or message, it has in the intention of the author none. The whole matter from beginning to end is mainly concerned with the relation of creation to making and subcreation. There is no allegory, moral, political, or contemporary in the work at all. Of course, my story is not an allegory of atomic power, but of power exerted for domination. It is not about anything but itself. Certainly it has no allegorical intentions, general, particular, or topical, moral, religious, or political. I have deliberately written a tale which is built on or out of certain religious ideas, but is not an allegory of them or anything else, and does not mention them overtly, still less preach them. It is mainly concerned with death and immortality. In The Lord of the Rings, the conflict is not basically about freedom, though that is naturally involved, It is about God and his sole right to divine honor. It is about death and the desire for deathlessness. As for message, I have none really, if by that is meant the conscious purpose in writing The Lord of the Rings, preaching, or of delivering myself of a vision of truth specially revealed to me. I said, or meant to say, that the message was the hideous peril of confusing true immortality with limitless serial longevity, freedom from time and clinging to time. In The Lord of the Rings, I neither preach nor teach. I would claim, if I did not think it presumptuous in one so ill-instructed, to have as one object the elucidation of truth and the encouragement of good morals in this real world. The invention of languages is the foundation. It is, to me anyway, largely an essay in linguistic aesthetic, as I sometimes say to people who ask me, what is it all about? Now, I've deliberately arranged this sampling of quotations to highlight some very interesting points about Tolkien's stated authorial intentions. We can see that Tolkien is perfectly willing to contradict himself, or at any rate, to seem to do so. He firmly states, it is not about anything but itself, but he also says that it is about death. It is fundamentally Catholic, but the invention of languages is the foundation. He declares that as for message, I have none, really, and that the message was the hideous peril of confusing true immortality with limitless serial longevity. Well, one approach to this variability would be to severely discount the reliability of Tolkien's statements about his own authorial intention, to declare that he's not a trustworthy source, and refuse to admit his statements as evidence to guide our interpretation of his works. We can avoid cherry picking by declaring the cherry tree off limits. I don't think we need to do this. I don't think we ought to do this. I think there are ways to approach his statements of authorial intent that will help us to navigate these apparent contradictions. But I will say that radical skepticism about the reliability of Tolkien's self-assessment is a more intellectually sound approach than simply picking and choosing the statement that fits one's argument and disregarding the statements that appear contradictory. I propose then to explore 4 concepts that I believe will help us to navigate Tolkien's statements of authorial intent. The first of these is the distinction that Tolkien makes between conscious and unconscious intention, as when he observed that E.A. Whipsmith's children's novel, The Marvelous Land of Snurgs, was, he said, probably an unconscious sourcebook for the hobbits. He didn't deliberately and consciously draw on Whipsmith's book to give him material for the hobbits, but rather he recognized after the fact that his imagination had assimilated and used it, which is evident if we look at the Snurgs and the hobbits. Even the illustrations of the Snurgs show this, but it's even more apparent in the text. This distinction helps to resolve some difficulties. For instance, writing to a correspondent about Tom Bombadil, Tolkien says, I do not mean him to be an allegory, or I should not have given him so particular, individual, and ridiculous a name. But allegory is the only mode of exhibiting certain functions. He is then an allegory, or an exemplar, a particular embodying of pure, real, natural science. He seems to have reversed in the space of a single sentence from, I do not mean him to be an allegory, to, he is therefore an allegory. But if we keep in mind the differences between conscious and unconscious intent, we can see that this isn't a contradiction at all. Tolkien didn't consciously intend for Tom Bombadil to be an allegorical figure, a point which is supported by the historical evidence. Tom is an existing character in the poetry. Then Tolkien evidently became consciously aware of what his creative imagination had done. As he put it, in historical fact, I put him in because I had already invented him independently and wanted an adventure on the way. But I kept him in, and as he was, because he represents certain things otherwise left out. This interplay between the conscious and unconscious forms of intention helps us to better understand the way that Tolkien often begins by apparently denying intention, only to follow with a statement that provides an intention. As for message, I have none really, if by that is meant the conscious purpose in writing The Lord of the Rings, of preaching, or of delivering myself of a vision of truth specially revealed to me. I was primarily writing an exciting story in an atmosphere and background such as I find personally attractive. But in such a process, inevitably one's own taste, ideas, and beliefs get taken up. Though it is only in reading the work myself, with criticisms in mind, that I become aware of the dominance of the theme of death. I said, or meant to say, that the message was the hideous peril of confusing true immortality with limitless serial longevity, freedom from time, and clinging to time. Here he is first identifying his primary conscious authorial intent, to write an exciting story. And in that sense, he's entirely correct to say, as he does elsewhere, that it was not about anything but itself, and that as for any inner meaning or message, it has, in the intention of the author, none. But then we get the characteristic Tolkienian pivot. Having cleared any misapprehensions aside about deliberate didactic purposes, he says, but in such a process, inevitably one's own taste, ideas, and beliefs get taken up. Inevitably, they get taken up. This is a process that happens without conscious, deliberate control. And then after the fact, he can recognize the themes, indeed the message, which his unconscious mind had infused into the work. Having discerned the message in his own work after the fact, he then felt able to state it as a meaning for the story without the caveats. It is mainly concerned with the death and immortality. Now, if we want to understand the meaning or message of death and immortality in The Lord of the Rings, the entry point would be to determine Tolkien's taste, ideas, and beliefs on this subject. Why is it a hideous peril to confuse true immortality with limitless serial longevity? It might not seem so terrible to readers, and that makes it all the more valuable to find the context to illuminate Tolkien's view. It would be important to determine what Tolkien believed as a devout Catholic about death and immortality. But it would also be relevant to consider his own encounters with death, both in his family and in the Great War, and to look at literary representations of immortality, such as H. Rider Haggard's She and King Solomon's Mines, both of which we know Tolkien to have read. His religious beliefs, his personal experiences, his reading habits, all of these provide useful information. How we rank these different sources of information, should we wish to rank them, is a tricky question that we can't get into just yet, but perhaps something that we could return to in the Q&A. The second concept that will help us is an awareness of Tolkien's habit of hyperbole. C.S. Lewis once remarked that Tolkien's lively mind sometimes leads him, with perfectly innocent intentions, to overstate things. Christopher Tolkien admitted that his father had a tendency toward the rhetorical superlative. And George Sayre recalled conversations over beer with Tolkien and the Lewis brothers, in which Tolkien might be smiling and genial, but a few seconds later, he might burst into savage, scathing criticism. Sayre felt that even when the topics were serious, there was an element of acting about this gesturing. Knowing Tolkien's enjoyment of hyperbole reminds us not to establish undue importance on how vehemently he expressed himself in any given statement. But it's more than that. Sometimes Tolkien uses hyperbole in what I can only describe as a strategic manner. A classic example of this is in the foreword to the second edition of The Lord of the Rings, which he says, I cordially dislike allegory in all its manifestations, and always have done so since I grew old and wary enough to detect its presence. Not only does he dislike allegory, but he dislikes it in all of its manifestations and has always done so. Well then, the trouble is this is simply not true. Many critics have noticed this. Tolkien did make use of allegory himself whenever it suited him, most obviously in the opening of Beowulf, Monsters and the Critics, but also in other works, including, by his own account, Leaf by Niggle and parts of Smith of Wootton Major. So what is going on here? In the foreword, he specifically declares that The Lord of the Rings is neither allegorical nor topical. But as we keep reading, it becomes apparent that he has a particular allegorical and topical reading in mind. He explains that a crucial chapter of The Lord of the Rings was written long before the foreshadow of 1939 had yet become a threat of inevitable disaster. Its sources are things long before in mind, or in some cases already written, and little or nothing in it was modified by the war that began in 1939 or its sequels. The real war does not resemble the legendary war in its process or its conclusion. His aim, in context, is to discourage readers from taking the War of the Ring as an allegory of the Second World War, as some were attempting to do. He's using hyperbole to make sure that a specific misreading is definitively squashed. Or consider his firm statement, there is no allegory, moral, political, or contemporary in the work at all. He goes on to say this, but of course, if one sets out to address adults, they will not be pleased, excited, or moved unless the whole or the incidents seem to be about something worth considering, more e.g. than mere danger and escape. There must be some relevance to the human situation of all periods. So something of the teller's own reflections and values will inevitably get worked in. This is not the same as allegory. We all in groups or as individuals exemplify general principles, but we do not represent them. The term allegory is very problematic for Tolkien. He repeatedly backs away from it, then he approaches it, he rejects it in favor of applicability, but then he admits its value after all. So when he denies that The Lord of the Rings is an allegory, he's not denying an underlying meaning. He's not denying he uses symbolism or even allegorical elements when it suits him. He's saying that the work as a whole is not in the literary category of allegory, which he as a medievalist understood very well, but it's one that readers who are not steeped in ancient medieval forms of writing, that is, most of his readers, tend to misunderstand and oversimplify. Now that's much too large a topic to address here. I've written about it elsewhere. A third point is the effect that Tolkien's Englishness has on his communication style. Now I'm aware that it's a bit presumptuous for me to talk about this as an American speaking to an Oxford University audience, and I do feel that keenly, but I do think that sometimes an outsider can helpfully call attention to things that you all may take for granted. I spend about a quarter of the year in Oxford every year and have done for more than a decade. And trust me, English people do not communicate like Americans. I'm reminded of a time years ago when I made the rash move of assigning on fairy stories to an undergraduate class. In the opening of that essay, as you know, Tolkien says that he proposes to speak about fairy stories. But, he says, I have not studied them professionally. I have hardly been more than a wandering explorer, a trespasser in the land, full of wonder but not of information. Later in the essay, he clears his throat by saying, ridiculous though it may be for one so ill instructed to have an opinion in this critical matter, before delivering a very precise rebuke, I venture to think the verbal distinction philologically inappropriate and the analysis inaccurate. One of my students raised his hand and asked, hey, if he doesn't know anything about this stuff, why are you making us read his essay? And so I was faced with the task of explaining to a class of American 18-year-olds that actually this is a characteristically English move of emphasizing his authority by downplaying it. And I don't think they bought it. But it's true. The English, as a rule, avoid earnestness. They avoid anything that might imply a lack of emotional self-restraint or gushiness. As Bertrand Russell remarked, the highest praise that many English people ever use is not bad. And we catch a glimpse of this in Tolkien's interviews. In one of them, after the interviewer praises the poetry in The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien admits that he prefers writing verse to almost anything else. Parenthetically, he adds, almost impossible to sell verse, though. Lest his sincerity about his poetry be mistaken for earnestness, he immediately deflates it. Tolkien's self-deprecation is particularly important with regard to his statements of authorial intent. He tends to downplay the things that matter to him most. With that in mind, we should perhaps pay closer attention to those remarks in which he does connect The Lord of the Rings with his faith, precisely because that's the sort of thing that his Englishness would tend to inhibit him from admitting. And now, suitably prepared, we can consider a fourth factor that affects Tolkien's statements of intention with regard specifically to the religious themes or ideas, we will not say messages, in his writing. He was forthright about his religious convictions, telling one interviewer, "I'm a Roman Catholic, devout Roman Catholic." He wrote in a 1958 letter that regarding the sources of The Lord of the Rings, "If I may say so with humility, the Christian religion, which I profess, is far the most powerful ultimate source. On a lower level, lower plane, my linguistic interest is the most powerful force." His faith was of profound importance to him. And when first The Hobbit and then The Lord of the Rings made him internationally famous, he now had a very large audience who were very interested in everything he had to say. And I think this put him in a bit of a bind. On the one hand, it gave him the opportunity to speak about his faith to a wider audience. And this would have raised at least a twinge of conscience, as he would see it as part of his responsibility as a professing Christian. On the other hand, he knew his limitations, and he had no inclination whatsoever to become an amateur theologian or a public apologist like his friend C.S. Lewis. Furthermore, his spiritual formation as a young man at the Birmingham Oratory of St. Philip Neri had placed a great emphasis on the value of humility. As a result, Tolkien was particularly sensitive to the spiritual dangers of letting himself be put on a pedestal. He was aware of this even with regard to merely literary praise from his readers, which he called incense, as in the incense offered before idols. If he were to become a public figure for his pronouncements on the spiritual life, many of his readers would have been all too ready to make him a guru, especially the Americans. And I think that his deliberate practice of humility helps to account for the way that he generally discusses these elements of his work in detail only with those correspondents and friends who shared his basic premises, such as Clyde Kilby, who was an evangelical Protestant, or Robert Murray, a fellow Catholic. With them, he could acknowledge the spiritual elements in his work without worrying about being taken as a religious expert. Related to this is the fact that Tolkien had a certain love of hiddenness. Even with regard to his literary sources, John Garth calls Tolkien a poker player. He holds his cards close to his chest. And that's even more the case when it comes to elements that draw on his faith. Tolkien sometimes deliberately cloaked his intentions in order to convey elements of theological mystery or the sacred. And we see this, for instance, in the significance of the Field of Cormallen, the scene which Tolkien called the eucatastrophe of the whole romance. And Michael Ward unpacked this very point in his talk on Peak Middle-earth for this Tolkien seminar series in last term, Michaelmas term. And so this quality of humility, even hiddenness, helps to account for at least some of the way that Tolkien sometimes downplays or denies the religious themes and ideas in his imaginative writings. All four of these points, conscious versus unconscious intent, hyperbole, Englishness, and humility, add up to indicate that we should be extremely cautious about extracting single sentences from Tolkien's letters and making them carry the weight of an apparently simple and clear authorial intent. Tolkien, much more than other authors, including Lewis, needs to be considered in context, assessing his tone, his audience, and the way that he introduces and then develops his points in the surrounding material. And we need to consider the larger context of his other remarks on the same topic. This picture is even further complicated by the fact that Tolkien himself sometimes even confessed ignorance about his own work. For instance, when asked about the colors of the other wizards, he replied, "I have not named the colors because I do not know them." Regarding the cats of Queen Beruthiel, he said, "I don't really know anything of her. She just popped up and obviously called for attention, but I don't really know anything certain about her. Well, oddly enough, I have a notion that she was the wife of one of the ship kings of Pelargir." He was even at times puzzled by his own work, and in later years looked at The Lord of the Rings as if it were from a strange hand. And he recognized the stylistic diversity of his own work, noting, for instance, that some features of the story are more mythical and others are more historical. You cannot press the one ring too hard, for it is, of course, a mythical feature, even though the world of the tales is conceived in more or less historical terms. And now, at last, let's turn to his famous statements about The Lord of the Rings being a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. It's useful first to observe that he's writing to Robert Murray, who was not only a Catholic, but a friend for whom he was somewhat of a mentor, having encouraged Murray in the process of becoming a Catholic. In this context, then, we can expect Tolkien to be a little less guarded than usual. Now we need to look at the longer passage for essential context. The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously so, but consciously in the revision. That is why I have not put in or have cut out practically all references to anything like religion, the cultural practices in the imaginary world. For the religious element is absorbed into the story and the symbolism. However, that is very clumsily put and sounds more self-important than I feel. For as a matter of fact, I have consciously planned very little, and should chiefly be grateful for having been brought up since I was 8, in a faith that has nourished me and taught me all the little that I know. This is a much more sophisticated self-analysis than it would seem from just that first line being quoted, as it so often is. He explains that his work was unconsciously religious and Catholic. That is, the underpinnings of the fundamentally religious and Catholic elements were not deliberately introduced through conscious authorial intent, but have emerged into his work unconsciously. Once he recognized those elements, then conscious authorial intent came into effect in shaping them in the revision. Recognizing this mix of conscious and unconscious authorial intent is helpful in avoiding both overstatements and false either-or situations. Is Aragorn a Christ figure in The Lord of the Rings? I think that that's an interpretation that can be supported by evidence in the published text. Did Tolkien have Aragorn in mind as a Christ figure from the beginning? Probably not, considering that in the first drafts of the book, Aragorn appears as a hobbit named Trotter who wears wooden shoes. I really would be interested to see a study that looks specifically at this element and the evolution of the manuscript. The way that it is, he says, consciously religious and Catholic in the revision, and that in the revisions he has cut out references to the practice of religion in the world of the story. Now, I don't know of any of such studies, but perhaps some in this audience will go and do it. Regardless of which elements were unconsciously and which were consciously intended, Tolkien explains that the religious element is absorbed into the story and the symbolism. I think that this particular statement of authorial intent carries a lot of weight and can be taken at or near face value, precisely because it is stated in such modest terms and it's followed by a characteristic bit of self-deprecation. However, that is very clumsily put and sounds more self-important than I feel. This element of his writing touches on the all-important aspect of his personal religious faith. And the more important something is to him, the more he tends to express himself in a self-deprecating manner. He goes on to say, "For as a matter of fact, I have consciously planned very little." And this statement is peculiarly revealing by its very understatement. Apart from recognizing the unconscious foundations of the religious elements in his work, it also concedes a point. He consciously planned very little, but that means that at least something was consciously planned. Returning to the first bit of this quote, the key word, it seems to me, is fundamentally, at the foundation. We see this idea again in another statement along similar lines. He says, "I have deliberately written a tale which is built on or out of certain religious ideas." Now we're running short on time if we want to fit in some Q&A. So let me just offer one thought about those religious ideas upon which he said that he had built a story. I would suggest that the basic way in which The Lord of the Rings is fundamentally religious is that it exists at all. Regarding the writing of fantasy, he says in his essay on fairy stories, "We make in our measure and in our derivative mode because we are made, and not only made, but made in the image and likeness of a maker." So, at the most fundamental level, The Lord of the Rings is religious, in Tolkien's view, because his own creative imagination, and therefore his ability to sub-create as a writer, derives from the divine creativity of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, of whom God the Son is the Word made flesh. Having this truly foundational concept in mind is, I think, helpful because it allows us to recognize the extremely wide range of ideas and themes that Tolkien could explore in his writings while being consistent with his devout Catholic faith. For instance, as he explains to a worried Catholic reader in letter 153, elvish reincarnation is not contrary to the Catholic faith. The Church's teachings on reincarnation apply only to humans, not to elves. Similarly, in letter 212, he's perfectly straightforward in saying that the creation story in his legendarium is very different in an important way from the Genesis account that he held to be true in the primary world. He explains that although in the Christian story, evil is introduced into the world after its creation, in his legendarium, the rebellion of created free will precedes creation of the world, Ea, and Ea has in it sub-creatively introduced evil, rebellions, discordant elements of its own nature already when the let it be was spoken. The clear theological distinction between the sub-created world and the primary world means that he could, with a clear conscience, explore what-ifs and counterfactuals in his imaginative world. So, to return to the title with which I began, did Tolkien intend to write a fundamentally religious and Catholic work? I would say no. He did not consciously and deliberately set out to make The Lord of the Rings into a religious and Catholic work. Rather, that aspect of the work arose osmotically from the whole cast of his mind and person. But also, yes, in that he recognized that this aspect of his work was present even in the draft, it was still in the draft, and he embraced it consciously as a legitimate part of his imaginative project. So if we keep that tension in mind, as well as the other factors that complicate the question of authorial intent, we will be reasonably prepared to make a more nuanced and thoughtful and well-informed interpretation of Tolkien's work. "And it is also said," answered Frodo, "Go not to the elves for counsel, for they will say both no and yes." "Is it indeed?" laughed Gildor. "Elves seldom give unguarded advice, for advice is a dangerous gift, even from the wise to the wise, and all courses may run ill. But if you demand advice, I will for friendship's sake give it. I think you should now go at once without delay, and if Gandalf does not come before you set out, then I also advise this: do not go alone. Take such friends as are trusty and willing." Thank you.